I'm happy to be joined today by Michael Ralph, who teaches in the School of Medicine at NYU. Dr. Ralph is the author of Forensics of Capital and the upcoming Life about the history of slave insurance and life insurance in the United States. He is also the author of a series of upcoming graphic novels, including Before 13th, which I'm hoping to ask him about in a little bit. Welcome, Dr. Ralph.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So to get us started off, can you talk a little bit about how the Atlantic slave trade transformed political and economic relationships in West Africa? What were some of the impacts of the trade on West African societies?
Well, I think there's a number of ways to think about how the transatlantic slave trade transformed West Africa. One of those ways has to do with the shift in the growing demand for enslaved labor throughout the world. It led African societies to shift from a focus on gold, focus on textiles. There are various other commodities in which many societies were trading and exchanging with Europeans, and it sort of led them to focus on enslaved labor and sort of capturing enslaved people for sale. It also strengthened the power of royal societies, kingdoms, and things like that, often at the expense of rural, smaller settlements and societies who became vulnerable to raids by highly militarized and well-armed societies run by rulers of massive kingdoms. I think there are a number of other ways as well. I think that the transatlantic slave trade led to a lot of highly skilled labor being sent around the world. So oftentimes in the most, familiar cliches and stereotypes about the slave trade, African people are just reduced to the status of brute labor, almost treated as livestock in some accounts. And the notion is somehow that it was just the backbreaking labor that made them valuable. But in fact, there are African people who were skilled at ironworking, skilled at various kinds of weaving, various forms of agriculture. And I think when we look closely at the historical record, and increasingly the research is revealing that the number of workers with a diverse range of skills who were extracted from the African continent and sent around the world through the transatlantic slave trade.
So you have, the creation of different sorts of trading opportunities and incentives in West Africa. Are you suggesting that there's sort of a brain drain coming out of West Africa from the slave trade?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think brain drain is a useful way to think about it because in many ways, the question of sort of capital or human capital is central to thinking about the ramifications of enslavement in the world. We now know that sort of when people leave different societies, especially a massive exodus at one time, can sort of really devastate one society or sort of enrich the human capital in another part of the world. Like there are various countries, let's say Nigeria, India, that send many doctors around the world, right? And so those countries are known for sort of the particular kinds of skilled labor that are leaving those countries and also arriving in other places. And I think in many ways, the transatlantic slave trade sort of demonstrates that phenomenon in a much earlier moment in time.
Yeah. Well, can you talk about a little more broadly the role that slavery played in facilitating the creation of Atlantic trading networks?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think when we think about trading networks, partly it has to do with commodities. We mentioned some, whether it's gold, various kinds of agricultural goods, but I think that also I often reflect on the fact that it transformed sort of the kinds of jobs African people were doing. Like one of the first jobs I think is worth noting is even on a slave ship, there were African people pressed into the role of sort of guardians or something, or security forces on those ships. So even to be security guarding other African people. And then there were also people sort of as guides and interpreters and translators and brokers on the west coast of Africa, and in sort of the different kind of riverine networks that Europeans had to rely on before they had extensive access to the African continent, to the heart of the African continent. So you have sort of African people in the role of intermediaries, and then you have African people being shifted into different parts of the world with their skills. And then you also have sort of emergent economies, whether sort of the plantation societies of the Americas in a range of different kinds of plantations. So obviously cotton plantations, sugarcane plantations, rice being farmed. And then I think often people overlook the extensive role of sort of industrial slaves. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that later, but you know, when you reflect on it, you can see that enslaved people sort of worked in several different categories. Some were working in really hazardous and dangerous industries like coal mines, railroads, steamboat workers by the 19th century. Others were artisans like blacksmiths, wheelwrights, bricklayers, and masons. And others were kind of bureaucrats like drivers and clerks and things like that. So, you know, over the centuries, enslaved people would essentially be part of every major industry, every conceivable industry you can imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point because I think when people often think about slavery in a context like the United States, they think about the plantation. But what you suggest in your work and what you're suggesting here is that slavery is far more extensive and slavery is profitable and slavery reaches into far more places than the plantation, obviously.
A lot of the research, for instance, on the history of capitalism, the history of slavery, centers on the Cotton Kingdom. You know, it'll specifically focus on the Mississippi River Valley in the early part of the 1800s, particularly in the 1830s, sort of when it was at its summit. And then also because of that focus, there's a related focus on the brutality and violence of enslavement. And of course, slavery was incredibly violent and coercive. But what's interesting is in that very same moment, the last few decades of legalized slavery, when profits were tremendous in part because of cotton, there was also sort of huge profits in part because of these various industrial roles that enslaved people played as well. So, you know, iron workers, masons, blacksmiths, who could be rented out to different corporations, rented out to other plantation owners, and were profitable in that way. And actually, in those roles, they experienced a lot more mobility than, say, plantation slaves picking cotton would have experienced. So I think slavery was profitable both for the kind of backbreaking, very coercive work, but also in terms of the sort of artisanal work that was highly valued in the marketplace. And I think it's important to sort of understand the range of strategies that planters and merchants use to extract value. And that also shapes the range of sort of working conditions that enslaved people experienced.
When you're talking about enslaved people being rented out, are you talking about in states like Virginia, where the plantation economy is shifting to the West, and plantation owners are looking for new ways to generate revenue?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the shift in sort of enslaved people being rented out and the related sort of phenomenon of enslaved people being insured really sort of takes off after 1808. So obviously after 1808, when the slave trade to the US was legally outlawed, there were only a few ways to acquire enslaved people after that. They could be kidnapped, but obviously that was sort of treacherous and difficult to do at times. Enslaved people could be bred, but that requires sort of attention to the life cycle, and that's a very elaborate process, which happened in places like Virginia. Or they could be, or people who had a lot of enslaved people already in abundance could rent them out. And often they would rent them out to other merchants or rent them to companies in emergent industries. And when they would rent them out, they would insure them because they wanted to make sure they could recover the value of the enslaved people if they died or were injured while in someone else's possession. And so after 1808 and decades to follow, a sort of industry was thriving and insured enslaved people. And in fact, the main categories of enslaved people who would be insured fell into the sort of categories I mentioned before, where some would be in very hazardous industries, railroads, coal mines, steamboats. Others would be artisans, blacksmiths, cobblers. And then there would be like the bureaucrats, like drivers, clerks, and things like that. And essentially, they'd be rented out, they'd be insured, they'd work for a fixed period of time and generate capital for their owners, but who continue to rent them out over and over again. In the process, they kind of emerged this sort of range of enslaved people with these skills that were highly valued in the marketplace. And in many ways, it was interesting because life insurance, you know, amongst ordinary citizens was really big in the US until the 1840s, because people were kind of skeptical of the idea that you could put a monetary value on a human life. Even in England, where sort of the first North Atlantic country to really have a booming life insurance industry was like 17. It was like the 18th and 19th century, yeah, excuse me, when it sort of started to take off late 18th, early 19th century. In the US was even later. And so you could argue that actually it was the traffic and insurance policies of enslaved people that sort of brought Americans to awareness about how valuable it might be to kind of secure against the loss of a particular kind of premium skill set in the marketplace.
When we think about American history, often like the rural plantation South is posed against the industrial North. But what you're talking about is the centrality of enslaved people to the building of industry in those jobs, but also to financial institutions, insurance. But you haven't mentioned banking, but also slavery is essential to the growth of banking in the United States as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's true that I think often the assumption people have about slavery being either pre-capitalist or somehow inefficient. Like the idea is that, well, slavery was brutal and violent and it laid the foundation for the current economic system, but it was part of a bygone era or something like that, rather than thinking about, as you know, like the kind of forms of financialization or the kind of strategies for extracting profit and for securing investments. And increasingly, I think, the research is revealing the sort of extensive role of insurance, banking, in the industry of enslavement, as well as certain techniques of accounting and, strategies for managing labor. And I think this is a perspective that comes out in the sort of historical anthropology of the Atlantic world, where someone like Sidney Mintz and later Michel Rolfe Trio were insisting that the Atlantic world is the sort of birth of the modern world, because the plantation economy is like the first modern economy, and enslaved people are the first sort of modern workers. So, they sort of were responding to historians who set the birth of sort of modern economic growth or the modern economy in the 19th century or perhaps the 18th century. And they want to insist that it goes back to the 15th century with the kind of dawn of plantation societies, that you have the birth of anything we call quote unquote modernity, And of course, Michel Rolfe Trio would insist that modernity is a project. So it's not as if it's fully fleshed out or fully formed, but there is this notion that it is kind of a notion of a new economic political strategy that can be profitable and that we can predict growth in a more secure and stable way.
How central is the development of the Atlantic slave trade to the creation of the world that we have today?
I think that part of what's important with the transatlantic slave trade is that even at the level of diplomacy, it sort of changed how nations would interact. Like I think before the slave trade, there was like a notion that smuggling was like a central part of economic growth. Piracy was central to economic growth. Often, if someone could acquire capital, it was less significant how they acquired it and more significant that they acquired it, right? Kingdoms would be in various kinds of political conflicts and waging wars. And really, the transatlantic slave trade and then the systematic abolition of the transatlantic slave trade brought about this kind of somewhat coherent diplomatic community that was invested in the notion of what would continue to be like legitimate commerce or illegitimate commerce. Suddenly, by the end of the slave trade, it was not appropriate and not legal to, in a very explicit way, traffic in the monetary value of a human life, And so I think that that's significant, for world history, that it's really the end of the transatlantic slave trade and the formal process of abolition that brought together this sort of global consensus on the fact that economic growth should be legitimate. But also, of course, as we discussed, like sending millions of people all around the world who already had various kinds of skills, and then also were later introduced to emergent industries and shaped those industries. The notion of sort of racial difference as part of what determines whether someone will have access to capital or access to the franchise, and then also shapes how people are governed. The notion of sort of racial difference. I wouldn't say that racial difference begins with the transatlantic slave trade, but I would say that it transformed in many ways how we understand race, in the sense that African descent being like a key criterion for whether someone will be given access to social mobility or denied access to social mobility. And so I think these are sort of various dynamics we could associate with the transatlantic slave trade.
You mentioned earlier that the slave trade continued after the United States outlawed the slave trade in 1808. Can you talk a little bit more about that, how that worked?
Yeah, so I think after it was outlawed, the slave trade to the U.S. outlawed. I mean, it kind of shifted. It was still sort of people were still sending enslaved people to various other places, right? Like Cuba and Brazil, perhaps most notably, continued to traffic and enslave people. But then, even after the trade ended, there was kind of what people now call the domestic trade, where it became a question of how enslaved people are shifted and moved around the U.S. So, you know, and this kind of corresponds to, breeding and also renting out and insuring, but also actually it corresponds to the movement west, and in many ways, slavery could assume a different form in other parts of the country. So I think a lot about Kentucky and writing about Kentucky, where in some ways, Kentucky is west of West Virginia. And at that time there was no West Virginia, so just initially when Kentucky's founded in like the 1790s, west of Virginia is Kentucky, and the people who came to Kentucky naturally being from Virginia, in many ways, thought of themselves as trying to kind of perfect the republic, and they sometimes called it a second paradise. They were like trying to make Kentucky as good as Virginia, but even better, and in some sense they were influenced by Thomas Jefferson, who had wanted to eliminate the use of capital punishment for serious crimes. And he had been traveling in France where they've been introducing penitentiaries. And, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that penitentiaries were initially a kind of liberal reform, and they were actually seen as a substitute for just hanging people or something like that. And this created this circumstance where, Kentucky, on the one hand, had slavery, but also was understanding itself as a much more noble, enlightened form of practicing enslavement. So in Kentucky also couldn't really have, they couldn't have plantations, like the agriculture wasn't suited to it. So instead of growing cotton, they wound up growing hemp. And so slavery in Kentucky took the form of enslaved people either working in livestock, but often largely in tobacco or hemp, and on small plots. So Kentucky had like legalized slavery, but it wasn't like huge plantations with like a lot of slaves. And so to kind of just say more about that story though, essentially what would happen is in Kentucky, they wound up building this prison. They first settled it following Thomas Jefferson's the insight, and they thought of this as like actually being like progressive, and instead they wouldn't have capital punishment, they would have the prison instead. And the first crime someone was convicted for was stealing a horse, and you could have been put to death for that crime before in Virginia, and instead this man had like a few months in jail. But over the decades, the prison was not profitable at all, and they sort of realized that they wanted to make it profitable. And this guy named Joel Scott, he convinced the state legislature to lease out the prison to him, and he would sort of run it as his own private business. And this is in 1825. So what's interesting about that is that, there's been a lot of attention lately toward the 13th Amendment and this idea that enslavement continued after it was legally outlawed through the 13th Amendment, which says that you cannot be convicted, you cannot be enslaved unless you're first convicted of a crime. But actually, as early as 1825, Kentucky was allowing people who were incarcerated to essentially be treated like enslaved people. Because what Joel Scott did was he introduced hemp farming into the prison, which had only been done by enslaved people until that juncture. And so by having people who are incarcerated now farm hemp in the prison, he essentially introduced this form of slave labor to the prison. And significantly, the people in that prison were mostly white initially. And they were like white men and then later women. And eventually there'd be people of various races in the prison. But it sort of reveals that this idea of convict leasing, or sort of the idea of having incarcerated people working as slaves, started several decades before the 13th Amendment was even passed. And it wasn't even just initially pioneered on African people, it was used on people first.
And that's the, am I right that that's the subject of the graphic novel that you're working
on? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. Yeah, and in some ways it's like a creative nonfiction book, but it's a graphic book. And basically telling this story about the history of convict leasing in Kentucky. And I'm kind of letting Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells be the kind of narrators of the story, because they had this conflict, because they both wrote about convict leasing, first of all, but they also had this conflict around the Chicago World's Fair in the 1890s, where they initially agreed to boycott it because there was such poor African-American representation in the Chicago World's Fair. But then Frederick Douglass was invited to speak by the Haitian delegation because he had formerly been an ambassador. And Ida B. Wells was upset that after agreeing to boycott it, that he would go ahead and participate in it. And they later patched it up. And Ida B. Wells wound up editing this book called The Reason Why the Colored American is Not at the Chicago World Exposition. And Frederick Douglass contributed to it. And so I'm kind of using that story of their feud and then also their work on convict leasing to tell the story of this prison in Kentucky, where it has this history of sort of pioneering convict leasing several decades before the 13th Amendment, which is why the book's called Before 13th. But, I think what it reveals is that although after emancipation, convict leasing would essentially be a way to keep African Americans in a condition analogous to slavery, that's not when it started or why it started. And I guess when I think about the two sort of projects we've been discussing side by side, like the work I've been doing on life insurance and the work on convict leasing, it feels like my argument is essentially that that the history of insurance reveals that even people who were enslaved could be highly skilled and could have sometimes a lifestyle approximating like a highly exploited wage worker. And then the convict leasing work, it's like even someone who's a free citizen could be exploited and have a lifestyle approximating that or approaching that of an enslaved person. And it's as if like highly skilled enslaved people and highly exploited free white people, there's a kind of continuum there where you could be on either side of the continuum and there's even a porous boundary between them. Like some historians have shown that like in places like Maryland in the last few decades of legalized slavery, if an enslaved person escaped and they were managing a household, like as a maid, they might just hire like a newly arrived European immigrant and pay them very little. So almost like a very skilled slave that they pay nothing and a not quite as skilled European immigrant who they pay very little was almost interchangeable for some of these households, So I think that's a very interesting story about kind of the porous boundaries around race and skill and value.
I think, it gets me thinking about sort of the problems that are created between the way that we draw these sort of sharp boundaries in general. I mean, the most famous book of African American history is called From Slavery to Freedom. And there is this like really, I think there's this sense, and I think it actually has sort of a morality or sort of like a moral content to this, right? That there is this era of slavery, then there's this era of freedom. Slavery is back here, freedom is up here. And you were talking about blurring the lines between sort of the end of the slave trade. I think we can blur the lines between often the North is thought of as free before the Civil War, and the South is thought of as enslaved. When in fact there are many enslaved people in the North. But we still have this attachment to this idea, this sort of sharp break between slavery, the era of slavery and era of freedom, and what that means in terms of our morality, sort of our economic relations. And I think you're complicating a lot of that. And even the idea of, the loophole in the 13th Amendment, right? That's become, I think, a lot more widely known with David DuVernay's film, and Angela Davis was talking about this way back. But I mean, even that sort of relies on this idea that there was slavery and then there was freedom, and the forms of exploitation that developed in freedom were of a different kind. And I think there is this way in which we attach or are taught to think about slavery as this untouchable evil, something that's in the past, something that is beyond the pale, something that we can't imagine in our own society, when in fact it is an extremely exploitive economic relationship, but one that is not so far removed from the types of processes of exploitation that we continue to practice today in different forms with different abilities, right? Because one of the things that made slavery work was the degree to which enslaved people could be exploited, right? So part of the equation is also what the labor force will, the power that the labor force has, or the power that workers have. Anyway, I'm rambling on, but I think there is something here about the way in which we draw these really sharp lines between eras and types, and the way we think about slavery in general.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think like sometimes when I think about insurance, history of insurance, I think about it like, well, when you go to a slave marketplace, slave auction, you can see the value of people in a sort of readily discernible way, right? They're worth X hundreds of dollars. And then, people are insured for their skills, they're enslaved, legally, technically their property, right? But then with life insurance on free citizens, people freely contract this policy, and it's based on like some kind of actuarial calculus, like projected future wages, family medical history, things like that. But this information that's the basis for the free person's insurance policy is confidential information, right? Like no one knows your salary, no one's supposed to know your salary, no one knows your medical history. These things are sort of confidential by law. And so what you could say about like life insurance, which comes about with the age of freedom, really, like, is that it's essentially like a hierarchy. It's a monetary calculus in the value of human lives, which is based on confidential information. And in a way, obviously that's, I guess, beneficial. No one knows your business. In a way, it's problematic because we really aren't aware of just how discrepant the value is in our lives, like how huge the sort of stratification is because it's based on private information. And that's often what I think of as freedom. Like freedom is sort of personal, private information. It is, the ability to voluntarily contract something, but objectively speaking, it still could be this huge sort of inequality and hierarchy. It's just that it's not public in the same way. It's not explicit in the same way, So freedom can mean a lot of things, but it doesn't mean, as you're saying, as you're pointing out too, like the absence of these coercive structures, like in a way, like people want to believe that there's a sharp break from slavery to freedom, but in fact, so much of what we could say about the free world is a continuation of things that we saw in slavery, or a reconfiguration of things we see in enslavement.
Can you talk a little bit about why people advocate for reparations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, first, I think it's worth noting that the economic, political condition of a lot of Caribbean countries is directly an outgrowth of histories of, centuries of colonial exploitation and enslavement. So, people will sometimes, as you noted earlier, dismiss these events as part of a bygone era, but not notice that, in the same way that like wealth can compound over generations, inequality and poverty can compound over generations. So it can leave some countries in a position where it's very difficult to gain any momentum or sort of like, achieve any kind of discernible growth because of all the indebtedness that they're grappling with. And even, in the most explicit cases, like say Haiti, where essentially, after the Haitian Revolution, the sort of sovereign nation of Haiti was in many ways extorted, right? Like punished, forced to pay massive debts to France for land and property destroyed during the revolution. And I think this goes back to the question of legitimacy, because if enslavement is just sort of one way of gaining wealth and a way that's equivalent to other ways, there's not much of an argument. But if enslavement is a crime against humanity, or kind of if transatlantic slave trade was riddled with kind of war crimes, then the people who suffered were victims and are deserving of recompense. Like there are many atrocities where at the time, people didn't really bat an eyelash, but later people say this was unjust, this was violent, this was coercive, and the victims are deserving of restitution and redress. So if in fact we believe that slavery was violent and, and it was a kind of atrocity, then the victims of atrocity are deserving of redress. And I think where it can be thorny is people will say like, oh, the people who perpetrated these sort of atrocities are no longer around, or how do we decide who gets the money? But to me, those are not really valid reasons not to pursue it, because, or people will say things like, oh, well, there's no way to put a monetary value on slavery. And of course, I understand that perspective, but we can say that with any atrocity, I sometimes will say to myself, like, in the same way that people of African descent are using like 23andMe and these new forms of genealogical research to decide, just to cover their ancestry. I wish there was like a financial version of 23andMe where corporations or families can trace their history back and find out how much they benefited from the history of the slave trade, like through financial records and things like that. And to the extent that we can actually identify which companies have profited tremendously from the slave trade, and often we can, at least, those companies could, be responsible for helping to redress these sort of crimes against humanity and things like that. But overall, I think that we can be much more imaginative and much more rigorous in our analysis and in our accounting of this.
I think there's something very, very conceptually powerful about a reparations framework, right? Where a lot of racism is rooted in this sort of notion of personal responsibility, that the condition or the position of Black people in American society is ultimately the responsibility of Black people, however that sort of gets embroidered, right? But a reparations framework flips it around, right? It is the theft, and it is the theft of the U.S. government, of corporations, the transfer of wealth, historic crimes that then create the responsibility of the state and the society to repay that crime. That I think it's a better framework. I mean, obviously, a better framework to start from for thinking about politics and society and actually dealing with the crimes that were created by slavery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree, and I think that like too often the discourse about slavery is shrouded in kind of shame, either, an attempt to shame people who are actively participating in it, or people sort of apologizing, feeling guilty for their involvement. But I think I'm much more interested in what it means to think about the legacy and reckon with it in practical terms. Like it's not about the shame. Like if someone feels bad about what the ancestors did, why not redress what their ancestors did? If someone has concerns about legacy of slavery, why not sort of activate that to translate that into sharing resources or something like that? So I think for a number of reasons, too often the conversation stays at the level of shame when in fact it could go someplace that's much more beneficial to all.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to sign off. Dr. Ralph, thank you so much for coming here and sharing your knowledge with our students. We really appreciate it.